So welcome to the day 2 of Science Polish Perspectives. I hope you enjoyed the talks yesterday and you're ready for our next talks today. This is a panel on humanities and social sciences, and we will have a great talks, 4 speakers. Our first speaker is Adam Izdebski, and I will just go quickly here. He's a group leader at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History and also associate professor at the Jagiellonian University. And he is a specialist in the ancient and medieval Eastern Mediterranean. And he will talk to us today about what triggers a climate crisis and the lessons from the natural and historical archives. I will just pass over to Adam so he can share the screen with us. Just 1 second. You can share the screen.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm sharing my screen now.
I would just
Is it working?
Yes, it's perfect. I would just quickly remind for all the attendees to put their questions in the Q&A function just at the bottom of the screen. And you can just write the questions all throughout the talk and we'll ask them at the end. And Adam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. For inviting me to give some overview of the work my group and many other collaborators are doing together. So we will focus on the question of what is a climate crisis from a historical perspective, and how can we really understand what triggered crisis that we can call climate crisis, so connected to climate variability in the past during the last 2 millennia. The talk outline is the following. We will begin with some very small basics. What I understand as archives, what are high resolution archives and why do we need them? And then we will move on to the challenge. So where is the smoking gun? How to really understand and let's say argue that a crisis that we see in the historical data is connected to crisis. We will then go through 3 examples: 1, the end of antiquity or the fall of Rome, and 2 from Polish history, one about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 17th century, another one about Krakow in the early modern times, and then we will finish with some concluding remarks. So now a few words about what I mean as archives. So archives is actually everything where you can find today information about the past. So it's not only archives in the sense of history or social science, so places where you put documents that you no longer need, but you would like to keep them. So you can have private archives, you can have archives like state archives as institutions, but actually everything can be an archive as long as you have a key to get any information from it. So you see the written sources, the usual archive of historian at the bottom of this picture, but actually it can be speleothems, so stalagmites in the caves. This can be mud at the bottom of the lakes. Any plant remains that you can study, any material remains of past human activity, so archaeological sites, but also human remains. Our own bones and teeth, they're also an archive, a source of information about the times in which we lived in, about the society we belong to, and so on. So then the whole question is, you have these different archives, and in order to, let's say, decipher the information from the past, you need different methods. And you can actually apply the same method quite often to several different archives. Of course, study of ancient texts, you can apply only to the written sources. But when you think about the study of DNA, ancient DNA, you can apply it to plant remains, to human remains. You can actually apply them to these methods to the study of lake sediments. And the same with the isotope analysis. You can go to human remains, you can go to lake sediments, to speleothems, and so on. So you have these large variety of different methods that you apply to different archives. And in this way, you can get a much more holistic knowledge. So both the knowledge about things that usually interest historians, such as, let's say, political stability, so political history, or production and exchange economy, but it's also something, but also knowledge about changes in the landscape, vegetation dynamics, climate changes, epidemics, and human well-being. So this is to very briefly explain the approach that we are taking at studying in a holistic way with a variety, in a pluridisciplinary way, a wide variety of natural and human archives from the past. And then a second very important notion, high resolution. This is the question about how detailed your information is in terms of the period of time it covers. And what you see here is a sediment core. So this is like a tube of mud taken from the bottom of a lake in Italy. And when you look at it, you can sample it. So take small amounts of this mud for analysis every 5 centimeters. But you can also do it every single centimeter or every half a centimeter. You can cut it into very small slices and then increase the resolution of your analysis. And just to give you an idea, and basically you have to remember that the deeper you go in the sediments, the deeper you go into the past. And just to show you what it means, when the resolution changes, this is a site that my group is studying in northern Greece, Lake Doiran. This is how it looks like when you have the resolution of 160 years. You see only very general trends over the last 2000 years, which are covered by this diagram. Then when we triple the resolution to 65 years, we see much more happening. So for instance, we now see around the year 600, we see a drop in the human activity, an increase in the forests, so the brown ones, the brown color on this on the left, and we can start connecting it with the Black Death that came to this area around that time. If we increase the resolution even more, we can see a lot of changes going on, and we can actually connect them with economic trends, warfare, political events, migrations, and so on. So this is why we need as high resolution as possible, actually, when we want to do research on history of the last 1,000 years in a meaningful way. Okay, let us move to the question of the smoking gun. What is really the challenge? If you go into a bookstore in Poland, in Germany, in the US, wherever, you will find a lot of academic and non-academic, let's say, popular books that try to show how the history of the world was either shaped by big epidemics like the Black Death or the climate variability. So books like The Fate of Rome, basically attributing the fall of the Roman Empire to climate and the pandemics of plague. The question is now, can you really do such a big picture without dwelling into the details? And what I'm going, can you just say, oh, climate was changing, human society was changing, there must have been some connection. What I'm going to argue today is actually that you need to go into a lot of detail in order to be able to find a smoking gun. So basically to trace the mechanism through which climate, this is what we focus on, but we also study epidemics in my group. So basically some of these environmental stressors had impact on human culture, human behavior, and what we call, let's say, the fate of human societies in historical times. So I will take you first an example that is related to this book, The Fate of Rome. End of Antiquity. This is our first case study, and I will begin with one site that has very high resolution data, a lake in Anatolia in central Turkey. And what is very important about this lake is that the same sediments were used to study both landscape change, and this is the pollen data on the left. So you see changes in the significance of tree crops, cereals, and forest trees in the landscape in this part of Turkey. And then on the right, you see changes in climatic factors. And what we see very well on the left is that there is a certain moment in time around 670s AD when basically agriculture collapses and the entire area is covered by forests. So there is large-scale secondary succession. And when you look at the right, at climate proxies, mostly for precipitation, which is the key climate factor for this part of the world that is important for agriculture, what you see that changes in climate, in hydrological conditions, hydroclimatic conditions, actually preceded changes in the in agriculture and land cover by a good 100 years. So there is no clear correlation between the two. And this is very important because actually here we can see it in very, very clear detail. And we see that the two are not necessarily connected. So there must be other factor, something else driving the human change, which we see in agriculture and in, let's say, the degree of human pressure on the landscape in this area, other than climate. And when we zoom out at the entire Mediterranean, we actually have several sites like that either show climate, and this is what you see here. There is a lot of regionality, regional variation in how winter humidity, so the key aspect of climate in the Mediterranean, changed over time. And then when we move on to the same data as we have from NAR on the landscape, we see that there is also a lot of variability in terms of how landscape change in different parts of the Mediterranean world. And what is really remarkable is that we cannot really connect the chronology of these changes to climate, except for some very specific cases where climate is more of a booster for economic expansion than a factor of collapse. But rather what we see is that it's very strongly connected to political history. So basically where the Roman structures survive the longest. This is where we have the strongest continuity of very intensive use of the landscape by the local human populations. So we cannot really establish a strong connection between climate and the fall of Rome, rather to the contrary. These seem to be relatively disjointed trajectories. Now let us focus on another high-resolution case study, and let us move to an area that we all know relatively well, so Central Europe, early modern Poland, so Rzeczpospolita, the Commonwealth, in its golden age and crisis from 1500 to 1800 CE. So as probably you all know, the biggest question of Polish history and the biggest question that Polish historians have been thinking of since the time of Joachim Lelevel in the first half of the 19th century is how we arrive from that, what you see now, to that. So basically we have this huge Central European empire that completely vanished in some 300 years and got conquered by its neighbors. And actually what is very interesting is that from relatively early on, from let's say the beginning of the 20th century, there has been an argument that what brought about this collapse was climatic instability and increase in the number of epidemics. That basically, let's say, the natural factors brought about the fall of the Commonwealth in some way. Of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, when Franciszek Bujak, a Polish historian and geographer from Krakow, came up with this hypothesis, what he could do, and he actually had an extremely innovative research program in his chair at his department in Lviv, where he became a professor in the interwar period, was to look into the written sources. So collect all information from the writings from the Commonwealth times to try to trace the climatic variability and the, let's say, epidemiological rhythm in the Commonwealth. This had its limitations, but now we can go much further and we can do much more statistical work, connect that with the modern climatology. And this is what you see at the bottom. This is actually drought frequency in different parts of present-day Poland for the last 500 years. Reconstructed on the basis of the written sources, but analyzed in a more advanced way using statistics and basically computer-aided methods that were not available to Bujak before the First World War, but actually much of it is based on his groundwork and his research group's groundwork. What you see on the top, SB, actually, is something that was absolutely not available to him. This is a reconstruction of major temperatures based for southeastern Poland and Slovakia, so, or let's say present-day Poland and Slovakia, based on the study of trees from the Tatra Mountains. And what you see on both of these reconstructions is that there has been quite a lot of climatic variability. So Bujak in some way was right that this was not a good period for in terms of climatic conditions for economic activity. You had both a moment of very warm springs and very cold springs in the 17th century. But as you see, this was going on for the entire 300 years. So both for the period of the of the golden age of the Commonwealth in the 16th and early 17th century, and later as well. So it's not that climate is somehow becoming much worse from, let's say, the 17th century, like that there is some clear drop, deterioration in climatic conditions to which we can attribute the crisis of the Commonwealth. So in order to understand that better, we've been working for many years with economic historians from Białystok and geologists from Poznań, focusing on Wielkopolska, Greater Poland, this most economically developed part of the Commonwealth. And what we do, we look at everything that we can learn from the historical sources, but you see that this is actually this is like the area between Poznań and Gniezno, what you see here. This is the local population, and you see that it's very low resolution. You have one data point every 100, 150 years. So we see there is decline in population, but we don't understand when it's happening, how it's happening. This gives us some hint of what is going on. In order to understand it better, we studied the natural archives. You see these 4 places we studied in northwestern Poland. We will focus on this at the left bottom between Poznań and Gniezno, the Kazanie peat bog. And this is the data we have. This is actually very well controlled for chronology, and we have information every 10 years. And what is very interesting here is that we see this transition, which is exactly at the time of the Swedish invasion, around 650, from very heavily cultivated landscape into a landscape that is basically to a large degree abandoned. So you see pine at the left, you see the cultivated plant species at the right with the arrows, and there is this big drop in the extent of cultivation and big increase in the forest species, in the secondary forest that is spreading on abandoned fields. And this basically shows us that there is a very specific moment when the crisis sets in. The crisis lasts for more than a century until the Prussian conquest of Greater Poland. And how the way we understand it, that it was actually the invasions from Sweden, from Russia, and from the south that took place in the middle of the 17th century that completely destroyed the resilience of the Commonwealth. And then really the epidemics and climate variability became a very strong factor that was holding off the recovery. So it played a role, but it did not play a role by itself. And now we go to our last example that comes from our project on Krakow that is published as Ekobiografia Krakowa in Polish by Znak, and it will be published this summer by Pittsburgh University Press as Krakow and Ecobiography in English and an international edition. And we focus on one chapter actually in which we studied climate history of Krakow. So we look again at these major temperatures that I already showed you, that are particularly relevant for Krakow and the Lesser Poland region. And we see these 3 cooling moments, cooling episodes. One is late medieval. For that, we actually have very little historical data to look at, but then we have one in the 17th century, and we have one around the times of Napoleon, so at the turn of the 18th and 19th century. We looked into different data that we have for the second and third cooling episode. This third one is particularly interesting. You see that the coldest springs actually occurred in around at the beginning of the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And what we found first is that there was a clear energy crisis during the second cooling. So these are prices of firewood and charcoal in Krakow, and they are skyrocketing basically in the 17th century. And we cannot attribute that to the population growth, because the population growth was actually happening between 1500 and 1600 when the prices were rising, but rather slowly. This skyrocketing seems to be clearly related for a much increased demand for wood, and probably also problems in the transport if the rivers that were used to take wood and charcoal from the Carpathians were frozen for a longer period of time during the year. So this is the first energy crisis. And it's remarkable that there is a similar energy crisis during the third cooling episode, but this time what happens is that there occurs an energy transition. So the blue color, the blue curve that you see here is the price of coal. So of not the charcoal that is produced of wood, but basically the coal that is our problem until today in terms of climate change. And what we see in Krakow is that because coal was so much cheaper, and because Krakow actually during Napoleon's times was for a few years blocked during these very cold winters and springs, blocked from the Carpathians because of the new borders that were created by the Princedom of Warsaw, by the Duchy of Warsaw, they shifted to coal that they could transport very easily into the city from, let's say, 20, 30 kilometers north of Krakow. And what we see, we also have historical measurements of temperatures from the University of Krakow already from the time, and we see that it was actually the entire heating season from October to March that was very cold at the time. And we also have historical sources that show that there was already a problem of carbon monoxide intoxication. So there were these Polish and German instructions how to use coal in order not to die, basically, from intoxication. And from 1814, we have estimates of the coal consumption that was basically 2 tons per person per year. So this was huge energy consumption, basically making clear that within some 20 years, the city shifted completely to coal as its main energy source and became a very modern place that was using fossil fuels to meet its energy needs some half a century earlier than any other place in Central Europe. So some conclusions. First of all, as I try to show you, we have to find the right place for climate in our historical narratives, in the stories we tell about the past. We cannot make it, the main mover, neither can we make epidemics. We have to understand and put effort to see climate as one of many factors in a complex nexus of social and ecological systems. And because of that, it does not have an obvious automatic impact per se, but for its entanglement into specific ecological, economic, political, etc. processes. So this is something that brings us quite close to Bruno Latour's actor network theory. So we really should reject the nature-culture divide and in some way bring climate into culture, treat it as some kind of non-human actor within a broader human, non-human actor. And also there is the question that we are working on a lot and we are making connections to policymakers. This is the question of the uses of the past. So how can we deploy these stories in the context of the current crisis? And first of all, our stories are in some way positive. They do not downplay the threat that we are facing, but they show the role for human agency, but they're also very specific and they can help us to build medium and long-term scenarios that can be useful for predicting climate, environment, society interactions and hence for policy planning. That's it. Thank you very much. And now I would be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was a great talk and a great overview of the climate changes over the years of our history. Very fascinating for someone who's never looked at it that way. So for attendees, you can ask the questions in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand and ask directly by, I can unmute you. But I will start first. So it was quite fascinating to see how those sort of dramatic climate changes were appearing at the same time as those political events or some maybe pandemic events. And it sort of makes me think whether how much there is a contribution of them to those events or how much they are the consequence of those political unrest. Because as someone who's not that in the field, I don't know how much we can impact by our political changes, the climate that we see afterwards. So if we have this partition of the Commonwealth, and then suddenly there is this decrease in this agriculture, how this impacts the climate around, what it does, the sort of consequence, or what are the sort of first the climate sort of changes, and then it allows for the invasions. So sort of like what comes first?
Yes, so actually this is something that perhaps I didn't make it clear enough. So actually, what we see is a more complicated situation. So we have, let's say, climate that is unstable over 300 years. So from the times of Jagiellonians to the times of Stanisław Poniatowski. we see epidemics coming in, and there were actually big plague epidemics in the 16th century, so during the Jagiellons as well as later. And we see that the economy was on the rise, there was huge demographic growth, but in some way, this Commonwealth, and this is something that we are studying in more detail in another project right now, it was able to cope with it. So and then we see in the middle of so long before the partitions, in the middle of the 17th century, some kind of ecological collapse. And there is no clear climate trigger or epidemic trigger. Actually, epidemics usually come on a large scale with warfare. So climate is kind of completely external and kind of a chance factor until today, when it's our own making. So it's a different situation, yes? But it's kind of completely external. Epidemics are usually connected with war, and like they bring it in and then it spreads. But in this case, it's really first the invasion and some kind of really material and institutional destruction of the Commonwealth by the potop, the Swedish invasion and everything else in the 1650s. And then it becomes vulnerable to climate. So it kind of loses this ability to buffer the climate instability or the epidemics. It's no longer able to cope. And this is in fact fascinating. This is something that we cannot explain to fully yet. What is exactly what it loses, you know, why it's so destructive, these invasions. So this is something that we want to really look into in the coming years, because then we have 150 years when they're constantly trying, like every generation is trying to do something about it, yes, rebuild it, but it doesn't work. So this is really, from this point of view, I must say, it's not only interesting for Polish history, but we have a fascinating case study, as good as the fall of the Roman Empire, I would say, even if set for us as Polish people, that can be used to answer a lot of theoretical, very general questions.
Yes, and that comes to our second question from Anna, one of the attendees. With having all this knowledge sort of from the past, how can we take it forward and understand or use it to plan sort of the midterm and long-term future? So how can we use it to predict what will happen next?
Yes, so history, of course, cannot be used to make direct predictions in the sense that we will happen what exactly will take place. But I would say in many ways, for instance, it shows us what is possible. So it shows us the range of possibilities, where if there is a certain, let's say, environmental stress, like a pandemic or a climate crisis, where is the weak point of a society, of a modern society, where we should explain the change to take place. And often history is able to show that it's not necessarily the direct impact on, let's say, supply chains or some agricultural production, because especially in the world like today, where everything is connected, and it was already very connected, you know, in the 16th century or even in the Roman times, there is a lot of mitigation strategies that you can apply relatively quickly. But actually, it might be more important to look at the institutional aspects, at the coherence of the society, at the cultural impacts, so whether people understand the threat at the very basic level, or they downplay it and do not adjust their behavior. This is something that I think, even comparing the responses to COVID in different countries today, we can see it very well that we have the same pathogen, but quite different trajectories.
Exactly. I had another question from the audience about whether, if there was no climate impact on the region that you're actually studying, but there is an impact on the neighboring regions, can you understand how that neighboring impact is actually affecting the region that you're interested? So, because for now we just focus, so if you're focusing just on the pollen dynamics of the climates, but whether you would look further out and look at the other regions and how that contributed to any changes.
Yes, this to some, so this of course makes this like a huge project, but this is a question that comes out, let's say, in two contexts. One context is migration, so whether climate could be kind of a push factor in some region and pushing people from this region to another, and this is not that easy actually. It seems that especially when looking at different nomadic societies in Central Asia that should be theoretically more sensitive, let's say more vulnerable to such push factors. It's not that automatic, but it might be an important context, especially that the Commonwealth was bordering with the steppes and with this entire, let's say, Tata. Not very military efficient nomadic polities in the southeast. So this is an important question. And then the second way is, you can have crisis, agricultural crisis, or some problems with communication when we think that it was all dependent on wind and not, fossil fuel power in this period of time elsewhere. So, but this could actually create some kind of actually positive impact, that you can have an agrarian crisis somewhere in Western Europe, and then actually there is even more demand for the Polish grain. And we have to remember that Poland at the time was really like a grain exporter. This was the main driver of the economy. So any crises that were occurring in other parts of Europe would be a positive impact, in the sense that they would increase prices, demand, and so on.
Yes. Thank you. We have just a last quick question before we move to the next speakers. And this is about the complexity of the data that you mentioned already, because your research is very interdisciplinary and the methodology is very interdisciplinary, taking different factors and how they interplay, such as the economics or the climate. So the question is like, what is, in your opinion, are the main challenges of interpreting such complex data?
So, there are many. If I were to pick up one, it's probably really the chronology. So that they have their uncertainties, and quite often you cannot be, until you study things in really big detail, you cannot be certain that things occur at the same time. Especially with the natural scientific data, there is always some, let's say, margin of uncertainty, whether, plus minus 10, 20 years and so on. And this makes it at times very difficult when you want to be really precise, I would say. And then you need to bring in, from the theoretical point of view, you need to play with different theoretical approaches to try to connect potential impacts and, let's say, the phenomena that each type of the data actually represents.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Adam, for your talk and for the answers to the questions. It was fascinating, and we are looking forward to read more about your research in the future.
Thank you.